Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Haitian Revolution Part 1, The Slave Society by Extra History. Now we've done a lot on the French Revolution, and so the Haitian Revolution here feels like a natural follow-up. We've covered it a bit in the past, but I find it a very fascinating historical event, and I'm excited that we get to do this series on it. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Saint-Domingue, 1791. Only a year before, the man had been a warrior in the Congo. Captured by his enemies, he was sold into slavery, crammed into a festering ship's hold. More than 1 out of every 7 captives taken died before they ever saw western shores. But he's one of the lucky ones. He at last makes it to the plantation, where he will likely die. He learns this from one of the few enslaved men who speaks his language. They will be raising sugarcane, a dangerous and exhausting task with a harvest season lasting from December to July. Half the new arrivals will die of disease before the year is out.
Yeah, now, of course, there are a lot of brutal slave plantations throughout the Americas at this point, but even among that group, sugar plantations are particularly brutal and particularly dangerous, right? They have a very short life expectancy, which is why so many new slaves need to be brought in to keep the process going. Now, what that means is that Saint-Domingue, right, the colony here, which will become Haiti, this is one of, if not the most brutal slave colonies of the region, right? Saint-Domingue is known widely to be extraordinarily brutal, right? So we're talking about an already brutal and dangerous system, and the sugar plantation economy of Saint-Domingue is right at the extreme end of that brutality.
And if they try to escape, they face punishments ranging from whipping to amputation. The men who harvest the cane have cuts all over their bodies. The women who process it are missing arms from the crushing machines or have massive burns from the boiling vats of sugar.
Yeah, it was very common to see enslaved people missing limbs from the machinery that was used in sugar processing, right? So people were, injured either from being whipped or from the process. Many people were missing limbs, many people were badly burned, right? Like I said, this was an extremely brutal process.
The death rates are so high, his guide says. Plantation owners don't bother providing food or clothing. They just buy more enslaved people when the current group is worked to death. But not for much longer, he says. It is good this new arrival is a warrior,
Hmm.
because they have use for warriors. There's going to be a revolution.
Yep.
The Haitian Revolution is a unique event, both an offshoot of the French Revolution and an anti-colonial struggle. Haiti would become the second American nation to successfully win independence. And it remains, to this day, history's only example of enslaved people successfully rising up against their oppressors, an act that stunned the world and reshuffled the political order. From inspiring movements in other colonies to forcing Napoleon to sell Louisiana to the United States, its effect would be profound. But there is no good ending for the people that fought and died to create the world's first government led by liberated slaves.
Hmm.
For the example of Haiti's revolution, including the violence of its rising, caused other nations to do everything they could to weaken the young government.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a lot to say about this throughout the series, I'm sure particularly near the end, right? Haiti manages to have this successful slave revolution. They free themselves from their enslavers and then free themselves from colonial domination. And because of that, they essentially face this very harsh treatment from the rest of the world, being cut off, isolated particularly politically, essentially punished for freeing themselves from slavery, And of course, the slave owners around the world are extremely fearful that Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, will inspire more slave revolutions, slave revolts, and so they are very fearful of Haiti and they want it to be cut off. Now, there's a lot more to be said about that. There's a lot more detail that we can go into, but essentially, Haiti has forever been punished for freeing themselves. And look at the position Haiti is still in. So it freed itself, and the rest of the world never forgave them for that.
Policies that, 200 years later, still impact Haiti and contribute to its current difficulties.
Mhm.
But the roots of that instability were there from the beginning. because the economy of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, later known as Haiti, was largely devoted to a single plant. In Saint-Domingue, sugar was king. French settlers arrived on the island of Hispaniola via Caribbean piracy. And though the island had been Columbus's first landing place in the Americas, after a century as a Spanish
Yeah, Hispaniola has long been a very important island in sort of world history.
colony, it was neglected and sparsely populated. By 1625, French pirates had begun setting up agricultural settlements on the western side, importing large numbers of African slaves. By 1697, the division was official,
Hmm.
splitting Hispaniola into the French Saint-Domingue in the west and the Spanish Santo-Domingo in the east.
Right, or what we know today as Haiti, Saint-Domingue, and the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo. Now, there will be points at which the island is unified, but of course today we have two separate independent countries.
And within 50 years, Saint-Domingue was a crucial part of the Atlantic trade. Because Saint-Domingue, as it turned out, was the ideal place to grow three products that Europe and its North American colonies couldn't get enough of.
Mm-hmm.
The first was indigo, a plant that produced a rich blue dye. Next was coffee, the beverage of choice during the Enlightenment. But mostly, it was sugar.
Yeah, so indigo, coffee, and sugar. These three crops are extremely important and key to Saint-Domingue's economy, also key to this trade between the Americas and Europe, but sugar is by far the most important, right? This is primarily a sugar-producing colony. We've already talked about how brutal the harvesting and production of sugar is in particular. So Saint-Domingue is particularly known as one of the more brutal of these colonies, though they're all pretty brutal and violent, but it's also known as one of the richest. Saint-Domingue makes France an absolutely monumental amount of money. I mean, it's sort of hard to overstate it. They are making bank on their colony of Saint-Domingue and is producing an immense amount of wealth for France because of this production of sugar.
A substance Europeans couldn't get enough of, whether raw or converted to rum. And the tiny colony of Saint-Domingue produced about half of the coffee and sugar consumed in Europe.
Yeah,
It was by far the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean, if not the world, and the jewel
there you go.
of France's imperial crown. In fact, 1 in every 25 Frenchmen had a job supported by the Saint-Domingue trade. But there was trouble.
So you can see here how important Saint-Domingue is to the French economy in particular, and also to the global economy. The amount of sugar and coffee it's producing, the immense amount of money it's making France, and all the jobs in France that rely on Saint-Domingue continuing to produce all that sugar and coffee. Right? In the 1700s, France has this developing sort of Atlantic-facing economy. A lot of these port cities pop up along the Atlantic, and they quickly become very populated and very wealthy due to trade with these French colonies in the Atlantic, right? Of course, this isn't just a process that's happening in France, it's much broader than that, but particularly in France, Saint-Domingue plays a big role in bringing in a lot of money and a lot of jobs.
Underneath the surface of this economic powerhouse, because Saint-Domingue was a slave society, a
Mhm.
place that didn't just have slavery, but was structured entirely around the bloody institution. And the different classes of people living in the colony all had different and overlapping grievances that would all explode once the burning fuse of revolution moved from America to France to the island itself.
Yeah, so I think a point we'll be making multiple times in the lead up to the revolution is that Saint-Domingue is really on the extreme end of a couple of spectrums, right? Brutality, wealth, in terms of the money that it's making for France. Also, that about 90% of the population of Saint-Domingue is enslaved. That's an extremely high percentage of enslaved people, right? If you look at, say, the American colonies that would become the United States, some of these southern colonies that are the highest percentage enslaved, we're looking 40, 50, maybe 60% enslaved population, right? That's seen as a lot, right? When the enslaved population matches or outnumbers the free population in the United States. Here in Haiti and Saint-Domingue, it's 90% of their population are enslaved people, right? So you can see just how much a mismatch that was, and why, even before the revolution happens, a lot of these white plantation owners are afraid of a revolt because they are so badly outnumbered. And we talk about the different sort of classes of people here. And by the way, I will point this out. I think I mentioned this before, but if you want a really great retelling of the Haitian Revolution and a lot of other revolutions for that matter, you should absolutely check out Mike Duncan's Revolution podcast. Really one of the best accessible popular history sources out there. He does a fantastic job going through a bunch of different revolutions, one of which is the Haitian Revolution. But on these different classes of people, we essentially have the vast majority of the population, which is an enslaved African population, and there's a lot of slaves being brought in every single year, right? Because it's so brutal and violent, so many of these enslaved people are dying that you constantly need to bring more people in, right? Life expectancy is very short once you arrive on the island. You've got a class of white plantation owners, right? Your wealthy whites, you call them big whites in the language of the time. You have a population of what you might call small whites, aka free white people who live on the island, and maybe they don't own a big plantation, but maybe they're a merchant, or they own one of the other businesses that keeps the island going, something like that. And then you have a population of what were called colored people, essentially free people of color who own their own property, and sometimes the more wealthy among them would actually own their own plantations and own enslaved people, right? So you can see here there is this sort of interesting dynamic. Now, there is obviously a big racial dynamic here where the enslaved population is all African, and you have this freed, people of color population who own slaves themselves, but the white people do not see them as equal, right? They still discriminate against this free population of people of color. And this will become a big issue leading up to the revolution. As I'm sure you can imagine, there's tension between the enslaved population and the free population, particularly their masters, the plantation owners, but there's also tension between the free whites and the free people of color, right? As the white people try and sort of squeeze them out of the economic pie, keep more and more of the money to themselves. There's a lot of complex dynamics here, but that's a sort of brief look at the social stratification of the colony of Saint-Domingue.
So when the revolution exploded in Saint-Domingue, it was not a single revolt, but multiple different risings focused on different issues,
Mm-hmm.
as much a civil war as a popular uprising. Now, this gets really complicated and nuanced fast.
Yeah.
But to understand what's going to happen, we have to give you a rundown of how society on Saint-Domingue stood in the 1780s,
Nope.
right as revolution was starting to brew in Paris.
They're probably going to cover what I just did.
So, we're going to look at three parts of Saint-Domingue's population: the whites, the free people of color, and the enslaved.
Right, so I sort of just went over this. Like I said, that there's more complexity here, right? You've got your sort of wealthy whites versus your, I don't know, working class whites, middling whites. There's different dynamics within each of these classes, but you have your white population, your free people of color, and your enslaved population.
The white plantation owners, known as the Big
Yep,
Whites,
big whites.
lived in huge estates. The city of Le Cap in the colony's north looked a little like Paris, with street grids and a massive theater. Their sons and daughters dressed in the most current fashions and read newspapers brought daily from Paris. In fact, many of these Big Whites didn't even live in Saint-Domingue, preferring rather to hold court in huge estates in France while others managed their land and finances.
Yeah, I mean, these are extremely wealthy people, right? We've talked about the amount of wealth that was being produced by sugar production and coffee, but, primarily sugar. So these were extremely wealthy plantation owners. You can think about the class of plantation owners in the American colonies in the United States, right? And so these are people who, as they pointed out, would often live back in France, enjoying everything they wanted back in the metropole, and they just have overseers managing their plantations back on the colony. And oftentimes, the greatest resentment would be from the enslaved population towards those overseers who were managing plantations in the absence of the wealthy owners.
Though rich, the Big Whites chafed under French economic policies, which forbade them from diversifying the local economy or selling their product to any place but France, even though British Barbados and America wanted their goods. And as the American colonies rose up, these Big Whites found themselves identifying with revolutionary plantation owners like Washington and Jefferson.
Yeah, so you've got some interesting dynamics here where they're still sort of within this system that France has set up, and they're thinking, well, we've seen these American revolutionaries stand up. against their metropole, against their colonial government. Maybe we could do something similar. They're not quite there yet, because we're talking about the lead up to the revolution, but they are thinking, maybe we should be doing our own thing. A lot of these big whites, what they want are essentially special rules for Saint-Domingue. Right? The argument they always make, and they have, of course, representation in the French. Well, we're talking post-revolution in the legislature. We're not quite at the revolution, but these are wealthy people, right? They have influence back in France. And so the argument they always make is that, well, Saint-Domingue, it's so different from France, from metropolitan France. And so we should have rules of our own. We should be able to more govern our own affairs, right? That's the argument they're making, and they sort of become more and more radicalized. Now, the interesting thing here is through the Haitian Revolution, we will see that different groups have different relationship to the French Revolution at various times, right? A group that may have been a fan of the revolution at one point sort of switches and they become opposed to it, right? So we'll sort of see this as it plays out. But this is a very dynamic situation where the social and political dynamics are constantly in flux.
And began to wonder if they too could win more economic freedom with a similar Declaration of Independence. Below these big whites were the so-called little whites, Frenchmen who arrived trying to make enough money so that they could go home rich. They were the bookkeepers, the plantation overseers, or shopkeepers.
Right, and the intention of white people coming to Saint-Domingue was usually that they wanted to make a lot of money and then go back to France, right? They usually didn't want to live there for the entirety of their life. As we talked about, those wealthy plantation owners, many of them would live in France full time, right? They'd have someone else manage their plantation. They didn't want to be out there in the colony. And so a lot of these small whites, petit blancs, they want to come out, hopefully make more money than they could back in Paris, say, back in France, and then they'll emigrate back to France and sort of live a comfortable life. That is sort of the idea. You also see this dynamic, and this is something we might talk about, where there's actually quite significant intermarriage between the free people of color and your sort of white population. It depends. Sometimes, it's often was white people sort of marrying up into wealthier free people of color families. But you also saw marriages between pretty successful white plantation owners and pretty successful black plantation owners, right? So you do see significant intermarriage prior to the Haitian Revolution here. Though, I will point out, and we'll probably mention this, in the years immediately leading up to the revolution, I'm talking the sort of, especially the 10 years leading up, but even before that, the last couple of decades, there was increasing racist laws passed and increasing discrimination against people of color in Saint-Domingue. And we're talking, this was primarily directed at the free people of color, right? I mean, the enslaved population were already under the boot heel of the plantation owners, but the sort of big whites wanted to, as I was saying earlier, sort of push out this population of free people of color so they could take more of the economic pie for themselves. And so you see more and more pressure against this population, and things like intermarriage become a little less normal, a little less popular. Something that had been pretty common in the past begins to become more and more stigmatized, right? So this is, once again, one of those things that starts building tension. You have your big whites who are sort of like, why do we have to bend to the economic whims of the metropole of France? You have the free people of color, some of whom, like I said, were pretty wealthy plantation owners, who were thinking, okay, we're being increasingly discriminated against. Why am I not equal to these white plantation owners? I own slaves. I make a lot of money. I should have equal rights to them. And then, of course, you have your 90% enslaved people who are like, I'm probably going to die, in like a year from now. This is extremely brutal. Let's free ourselves, right? That may be the most obvious motivation of all, right? But all these different groups have got different issues that are leading them to become more radicalized.
They, in other words, fulfilled any job that did not require physical labor. These little whites resented the big whites for their money and power, looked down on the enslaved as inferior, and considered the colony's free people of color, often richer and better educated, as economic rivals.
Yeah, well, you imagine these little whites, petite blancs, as they said. They didn't like the big whites, right? Because they were richer than them. They looked down on the enslaved population, and they were quite resentful towards the free people of color, right? You have this, say sort of middle class or poor white person who sees, this black plantation owner, this free person of color who's quite wealthy, and this little white feels like, well, I'm superior to him by the color of my skin, and he's very resentful that this other person could be wealthier than him, or even this sort of idea that he could have a better social standing, which is why the laws grow increasingly racist in the years leading up to the revolution, because white people, they do not want to be, sort of below socially anybody who's black, even if they are wealthier than them, right?
The free people of color require a bit of explanation, as they were a fairly unique class to the Caribbean. In the early days of the colony, men outnumbered women heavily, and there were few female colonists. This led to a large number of Frenchmen having coerced or violently forced relations with female slaves.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, these French men freed and married the women or freed the resulting children. Over time, this created a class of people known as the free people of color.
Yeah, so you have a phenomenon that happens everywhere, which is essentially white slave owners abusing their slaves and having children with them. But the way it's treated depends on where you look, right? So here in Saint-Domingue, over time, it's sort of more common for you to free the woman, and more common to free your children, right? Your mixed children, and then to pass them down some of your wealth, right? That's seen as pretty normal. Whereas you can look, I keep comparing to the United States, but it's just because it serves as a sort of easy comparison point to see some of the differences between these two systems. You can look at the American colonies that would become the United States, and this type of thing, of course, slave owners abuse their slaves, right? But it is extremely uncommon to free your mistress and free your mixed children. Not to say it never happens, but it's far less common. And even when it does happen, it's very much sort of socially shunned. It's not something to be open about. It's something that if you do, you got to be really quiet about it. So this is not really an accepted part of society in the United States. But in Saint-Domingue, it is, right? It's an accepted part of society that you may have a mistress among your slaves. You may have children with her, and then you may free her, but you'll definitely, almost certainly, free your enslaved children, and you'll probably pass them down some of your wealth, which, like I said, is how you get this population of free people of color, some of whom were pretty wealthy, very wealthy, in fact.
Who became a distinct economic force. You see, under the laws of France, the free people of color were not equal. They couldn't vote, for instance, but they could hold land and inherit property. And unlike the little whites, who were always taking their earnings back to France, the free people of color stayed put and built multi-generational fortunes. As a result, many prospered, often coming to own plantations with their own enslaved workforce.
Yep.
Indeed, new arrivals to the colony from France often crossed the color line to marry into this group due to their wealth and
Exactly, right? So you've got these sort of a middling Frenchmen coming to Saint-Domingue, and they're essentially marrying up into these wealthy black families, right? You may be a middle-class white person, you can marry into this plantation-owning family. That's a lot of money for you. Now, of course, like I said, they're sort of growing increasingly racist as the years go on. So this gets sort of less and less normal, but for a while, this is not a particularly abnormal type of thing. And in terms of the sort of free people of color and the enslaved population, there is oftentimes this association which has truth to it, which is, as we saw, a lot of the free people of color tended to be mixed, right? So what we might call light-skinned, and the enslaved people tended to not be mixed, right? So we're talking about darker Africans, right? So there was often this difference in skin color sort of visually. Now, that's not necessarily always the case, right? As we know, people can sort of look differently. People who are siblings who have the same parents can have sort of different shades, even if they share genetics very strongly. So, the association, I wouldn't take it too far, but this was an association at this time. The sort of wealthy free people of color tended to be mixed, right? That was something that was generally true, tended to be lighter skinned, and was sort of this split that will persist among the black population of Saint-Domingue even after freedom for the slaves. I'm sure you could imagine there is a little bit of remaining resentment between this sort of enslaved population who, after the revolution, looks at some of these light skinned black people and they say, hey, you were a slave owner. You like owned me. And of course, some people are like, well, we're all unified now. So, this is something to keep an eye on because it does remain a bit of an issue even after the revolution.
Local connections. Like the big whites, they dressed in French fashion. Or at least they did, until a series of racist
Yep.
apartheid laws, championed by the little whites and sweeping in after an aborted 1758 slave revolt, came into force.
So that's exactly what I was talking about, right? Now, the free people of color are never equal to the white population. Never. But things start to get a lot worse in those few decades leading up to the revolution, right? And as you said, this is particularly pushed by a lot of those small whites, a lot of your middling whites who have a lot of resentment towards these free people of color. They essentially want to put them back in their place. That's how they see it. They can't believe that they see these free people of color who are wealthy, who are dressed nice, who are going to the theater, doing all these things. They don't want that to happen. And so, the free people of color find themselves increasingly restricted in what they're able to do in those years leading up to the revolution.
These new laws barred them from public office, disallowed wearing European-style clothes, and restricted where they could live. Official documents had to indicate that they were colored, since many of these people of color might only have one black grandparent and could easily pass for white.
Right, right. So I was just talking about skin color there a moment ago, right? So, I was sort of making the point that oftentimes these free people of color, especially given that they came from these mixed relationships, and then oftentimes they would marry to sort of middling whites who wanted to marry up. They could be, not only light-skinned, but very light-skinned, as in sometimes passing for white light-skinned, which was seen as a threat to a lot of these middling whites who were like, I don't like the sound of that. No, you gotta tell me, okay? You gotta tell me if you're a person of color.
And bizarre charts tracked blood quantum to figure out exactly how black someone was.
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing you see in a lot of these American colonies at this time throughout the Americas. You have the sort of Spanish casta system where, and like this was true in different forms for the British, French, etc. colonies, where you're essentially tracking, all right, so let's look at your ancestry. Okay, you've got, one black great grandparent, one indigenous, a white, this percentage, it's all this very complicated stuff that doesn't really mean anything, but this is often how social standing was quantified, right? It's a caste system, right? That's the idea.
With a fairer system still within living memory, the free people of color would see the French Revolution as an opportunity to gain legal equality as citizens.
Yeah, and so you're already seeing that there's a bit of conflict between how these types of people might view a revolution that breaks out, right? The sort of white plantation owners are looking at the American Revolution and saying, hey, let's do that. Let's free ourselves from this oppressive French trade policy so that we can keep owning plantations and make even more money for ourselves. Whereas the free people of color are like, hey, a revolution, well, maybe that would let us equalize our position. Maybe we could get rid of these racist laws.
Would see the French Revolution as an opportunity to gain legal equality as citizens.
Hmm.
Though don't mistake that for abolitionism.
Oh, absolutely.
They often saw themselves as separate from the recently arrived enslaved and opposed the idea of emancipation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Remember, many of these free people of color were slave owners, right? They did not want to free the enslaved people. I mean, there's some exceptions, but mostly they did not, right? They did not feel any sort of solidarity with the enslaved people that they owned, right? So for them, they're sort of saying, look, we want racial equality, but we don't want like social equality. No, we still want this class of enslaved people who we can force to do all the work for us and who we can make a lot of money off of.
And then there were the enslaved, a group that outnumbered all the other
Oh, yeah.
groups 10 to 1, and a population that died so fast due to disease, mistreatment, and the tortures of forced labor that a third of all enslaved people kidnapped from Africa went to Saint-Domingue. Recently arrived from different areas, they spoke a common French Creole and developed Vodou, a system of religious beliefs that melded African
aka voodoo.
religious elements with Catholicism. And while any open resistance was put down with violent punishments, including being thrown into boiling sugar, eaten alive by insects,
Yeah.
or blown up with gunpowder, the enslaved developed other methods of economic sabotage. In some cases, they might go on strike, disappearing until a particularly cruel overseer was fired.
Yeah, so there's a lot of resistance that happens even before the revolution. I think this is something that's missed in a lot of history of slavery throughout the Americas. Well, first of all, there were a lot of revolts, right? There's a lot of slave revolts throughout the Americas. I mean, that's a very broad statement, but there were a ton. You may not necessarily know about them, but there were. And even disregarding that, there was a lot of more sort of daily resistance, right? There were a lot of ways that enslaved people could try and resist the situation they were in. One way they're putting out here is marronage, aka running away, right? You commit marronage, you run away, you become a maroon. So we have these maroon communities of runaway slaves. Now, there were two forms of marronage. There was, you might notice this theme with a lot of French stuff at this time. There's petite and grand, small and big. So there's petite marronage, which essentially was when you would run away until a particular condition was met. So as they're pointing out here, you might refuse to work or run away until a particularly brutal overseer was fired, and then you'd come back. Then there was grand marronage, which is when you ran away for good, right? And that's why you see the formation of maroon communities in these sort of mountains of Hispaniola, runaway slaves who fled their plantations and subsisted on their own, right? So this is one of the ways you can resist, but there were many different ways, even short of a straight up revolt or revolution.
And groups of escaped slaves, known as Maroons, lived in the mountains, raiding plantations for supplies and carrying out guerrilla warfare. But there were also more everyday forms of resistance: slow work, faking illness, or pretending not to understand tasks. Tactics that proved so effective that the colony's white population were thoroughly convinced that the enslaved were stupid and lazy.
Yeah, well, this is a stereotype that developed about the enslaved population, and a stereotype that racists have kept going that these enslaved African populations, they're stupid and lazy. And a big part of that stereotype comes from the fact that the enslaved people would, of course, work as slowly as possible, would feign sickness, would pretend not to understand what they were being told, which makes a lot of sense. You know, you can imagine you're an enslaved person. You know, you don't want to keep things running smoothly. You want to try and resist as much as possible, work as slowly as possible. Anything you can do on a daily basis, usually anything you can do short of actually being punished. But as we've seen, there were bigger forms of resistance that you, of course, risked very serious punishment for that people would still do. Right? So people were, enslaved people, they were not like, oh yeah, we want to keep this plantation running smoothly and quickly. No, they wanted to run it as slowly as possible, and that's essentially what they did.
An attitude that caused them to fatally underestimate the threat when the revolution came,
Right.
and the battered enslaved turned their machetes to a different use.
No, that's exactly right. Well, I don't want to get too much into this because we'll see this when the revolution breaks out. But among the white population, they're extremely afraid of a slave revolution, but they don't really believe that the slaves could actually overthrow the order on Saint-Domingue. And even when it kicks off, a lot of these white plantation owners are sort of like, there's no, what, you're telling me they're staging a coordinated armed uprising? There's no way. They literally cannot believe it. That's because they have this stereotype about the enslaved people, and they underestimate them, right? They do not realize, they don't see that these enslaved people have been planning behind the scenes, having meetings, coordinating in secret, and they're planning this big, like I said, coordinated uprising. They don't see it coming.
Because while there were divisions in class, even among the enslaved, they did have a unifying cause. They wanted freedom, and to put the plantations to the torch.
Oh yeah. Alrighty. That is the end of part one. I had a lot to say in this one. I've got a lot to say. I think I'll have a lot to say in many of these episodes. Sorry if it's a little bit jumbled, but the Haitian Revolution, something that I do know a bit about, to put it lightly. So it's the type of thing that if I wrote down my thoughts, they'd come out a little more clearly. But I'm just sort of reacting as we go, and so there'll be a lot of yapping throughout this one. That's just how it is. So if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and it'll give you access to exclusive reactions. With all that, I hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.